you see when you went? How long were you in Amsterdam, and what did you see while you were there?
I was only there for about a week, so it wasn't like a tremendous amount of time. But I sat in with Analu doing several assessments, like psychiatric assessments, and I sat in with the team, while they discussed cases because they would thoroughly discuss every single case before they did anything. And the team was...
Laura Edwards-Leeper first visited the Amsterdam clinic back in 2007, shortly after the Dutch published the first outline of their protocol and word of this new treatment had started to spread overseas.
I was just sitting there like, wide-eyed, like, okay, trying to soak it all in as much as I could. But
she had just been hired as a part-time clinical psychologist for the very first youth gender clinic in the U.S., and she had been sent there to learn their process.
The Dutch were very, very strict with who they allowed to start hormones. And so I remember talking to Analu after some of the assessments that I sat in on and asking, why she wasn't like approving hormones for this kid, where from what I could tell, the mental health issues were really directly tied to the gender dysphoria. And it seemed like that would really help. But they, were just following a very, very strict protocol. And that's what helped me figure out what to do back in the U.S., like when I came back to Boston.
Mm-hmm. So you were adapting their approach, right? You couldn't replicate their approach.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely could not replicate it because, first of all, they had a lot of mental health people, and one endocrinologist. It was like just very, very heavy mental health component. Mm-hmm. And I was one person with like 4 hours a week devoted to this. Like, so,
wow.
There was no possible way that I was going to be able to, yeah.
Do you worry about that first jump from the sort of way the Dutch were doing things to how things kind of evolved here?
Yeah. Yes, I do. I mean, and I actually was thinking about this the other day, how they were so generous. They took me under their wing. They taught me the ropes and then trusted me to bring this to our country and try to make it work. And there is a part of me that definitely feels like I've let them down in some way. It's weird. I mean, because obviously I know I can't be that responsible. I'm not responsible for all of this, going wrong. But I think that they know, I hope that they know how hard I've tried to keep things on the right track.
From the New York Times, I'm Austin Mitchell. This is The Protocol with Azine Qureshi. Part 3, The American Approach.
I got my first job at Boston Children's Hospital, actually in the primary care center there. And while I was working in primary care, the gender program was getting started. And so I saw an email saying that they needed a very part-time psychologist and responded immediately,
When Laura started at the new gender clinic at Boston Children's Hospital, known as GEMS, she was excited.
I've been always very interested in gender development. And specifically, I was really interested in adolescent girls and their development.
But she had never really worked with kids who had gender dysphoria before.
Because that was not talked about at that time. That wasn't an area of focus.
At this point, there weren't really any mental health providers in the U.S. who had experience working with these kids the way the Dutch did. The dominant approach was behavioral. So kids would often end up seeing psychologists who were focused on steering them toward their birth sex.
You just need to take away all of the boys' toys and encourage them, to do the girl things, and then they'll be fine being a girl.
But this new clinic in Boston was going to be different because one of the founders had been following what the Dutch were doing with puberty blockers and wanted to offer that care in the U.S., which is why he'd sent Laura to the Netherlands to learn the Dutch process. And when she got back and started to adapt it, there was one change she knew she would have to make right away.
Their assessment process, they did kind of over the course of a year or more, I think.
In the Netherlands, most people lived within driving distance of the clinic and could come for regular visits. But in the U.S.,
people were going to be coming from all over the country. So obviously they weren't going to be able to meet with me, for therapy, over every week.
Kids would have to travel to Boston from all over the country. So it wasn't going to be possible to have multiple sessions over the course of a year.
And so basically what I created was a structured clinical interview.
So what the Dutch had done across many months, Laura packed into a single session on a single day.
Lots of questions about gender identity development, what's going on in the family, significant events in the kid's life. Of course, asking about like abuse and trauma and all of that kind of stuff was an important piece. And then in addition to the clinical interview, then I used, these various psychological measures or, questionnaires that ask questions about mental health as well as gender-related things. Mm-hmm. And then I would do a feedback session where I verbally go over all of the results and information. And so,
4 hours a week just seems impossible to do the job that you were just describing. I mean, how long were the assessments?
Yeah, so basically what it ended up looking like was, I think I did like 1 to 2 assessments a month. Mm-hmm.
Oh wow! So it was that there were that few patients that.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah. But what occurred to me after 1 or 2 of those assessments was that it was just me making the decision, someone who was very new to this field, and only one person, where the Dutch had at least 2 people, weighing in
a year.
Over the course of a year.
Yeah.
So I felt very overwhelmed by the responsibility that was on me to, be a gatekeeper, because really I was expected to be a gatekeeper at that point. These days we never say that, and I don't really think of it that way. But at the time, I was absolutely expected to be a gatekeeper. And
so you're like stamping yes or no.
Yes, yeah, right, exactly. And so I guess I was nervous about, just being responsible for making a decision that would lead to a person, a young person, changing their body permanently. I mean, that just seemed like a really huge responsibility.
So almost as soon as she started, Laura decided to make another adjustment to the protocol.
We were going to require the young person to be in therapy with someone who was going to work with them longer term.
She decided that kids had to see a mental health provider on their own for at least 8 months before they could have their appointment with her in Boston.
We wanted them to be with somebody, like established relationship with a therapist, long enough that the therapist could weigh in.
Right. And know them well.
And also so that that therapist could stay with them through the course of, if they did start hormones, and they would have someone to support them. The problem, though, for the first several years was getting those mental health people to agree to be a part of it, because no one knew anything about this work. And so, I spent time, sort of being a cheerleader on the phone with people around the mental health people around the country, and telling them what kinds of things to do to provide support, and how to, ask questions to just engage in therapy with the kid, and basically just help alleviate the therapist's anxiety around being involved. I felt like I didn't know a whole lot, but they knew even less. But it did feel good just to know that there was at least another mental health person who was weighing in. And I felt like I was more closely following the Dutch.
Mm-hmm. There's just so much new here. I really listening to you right now, it seems do you ever look back and think did I even know what I was doing? But just that nothing, there was no infrastructure for this care in the United States. Were you ever just nervous about doing it at all?
It's funny. I was trying to find some of my old notes, and I couldn't find anything other than my personal journal where I unfortunately did not write a whole lot about what I was doing work-wise. It was more just my life at that time, and being over in the Europe by myself for a while. But it was reminding me that as I read that I had no clue how huge this was going to be. I absolutely no clue.
In the first 4 years at the clinic, Laura saw just 70 or so patients and passed nearly all of them on for puberty blockers or hormones.
It was pretty rare that I said no. I mean, at the beginning, when the cases were straightforward, just the fact that the young person was surviving in the world as a trans person when everything was going against them, but yet they couldn't live any other way. Like their dysphoria was so severe that once we treated them medically, their mental health did improve drastically. And I remember giving talks about how many kids were able to stop taking their psych meds after they started transitioning, because it really, it was clearly tied to that. So when I saw how incredibly helpful it was to so many of these kids, it really confirmed for me that it was the right intervention.
In 2011, Laura and her family moved to the Pacific Northwest. That same year, Analu published her landmark puberty blockers paper.
And then it just kept growing.
Laura was consulting with doctors and hospitals across the country.
There was just a growing need to train psychologists and other mental health providers on the assessment especially, but meant just the therapy too.
She was also teaching her approach to clinical psychology grad students.
Felt like I was starting to make a dent in getting my field up to speed.
Youth gender programs were opening at major children's hospitals in Chicago, Cincinnati, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And then, around 2014, 2015, while Laura was working with a new clinic in Portland, she noticed a lot more kids were showing up for care.
And it was just filling up like crazy.
What Laura was seeing wasn't just happening in Portland. Around the US, in Canada, and across Europe, clinics were reporting a surge in demand. One of the biggest recorded increases was in England, where referrals went from 200 in 2011 to 1,400 in 2015.
I think, in terms of the time frame, people often ask, well, why did the numbers increase at that point? And the most common response you get from a lot of people is, well, it was talked about more, and so the acceptance, right? And so people felt more comfortable coming out.
Most clinicians agree that part of what was contributing to the increase in demand was growing advocacy and awareness of trans identity. It was Caitlyn Jenner on the cover of Vanity Fair, Laverne Cox on Orange is the New Black. Time magazine called this moment the trans tipping point.
Which I think absolutely explains part of it, but that there is no way that explains all of it. Absolutely no way from my perspective that explains all of it. I think the internet is a huge piece of it, because when I started this work, none of these kids there was no social media. There was no...
In Laura's mind, the surge in demand also had to do with the new ways kids were connecting and accessing information online.
And so I think that's been a huge thing that has shifted, that has led to an increased number of young people questioning, their gender and sometimes, getting answers much sooner than they would have otherwise,
But it wasn't just that clinics were seeing a lot more patients. They were also reporting that the kinds of patients coming in were starting to change too.
To be more assigned females.
There were far more kids who were born female. In a lot of clinics, it was twice as many, whereas before there had been slightly more kids who were born male. There were also more kids identifying as non-binary, so not as trans boys or trans girls, but more fluid or in between.
But aside from that, the big things were the later onset of gender dysphoria with no childhood, gender confusion.
There were more kids who had first expressed feelings of gender dysphoria in their teenage years, as opposed to early childhood. And
much, much more complex mental health presentations.
There were kids who had more complicated psychological profiles, with higher rates of conditions like anxiety, depression, ADHD. There were also even more kids with autism compared to years before. It was a new group of patients that often didn't fit the profile of the kids the Dutch studied. They weren't like FG or Manon. And Laura said she started to notice that as more and more clinics were opening in the U.S. to meet the demands of this new group of patients,
So what did you start to see over time as more of these clinics opened up? What was your sense of how they were approaching things?
It definitely shifted over.
The thinking over how best to treat them was changing too.
To follow the kid's lead and to be supportive and to affirm and to help get the parents on board.
She was seeing providers moving away from extensive mental health assessments and toward an approach that put much more emphasis on what the kids said they wanted.
Meaning to just listen to the kid and help explain to the parents what the kid is saying, and then help facilitate the connection with a medical clinic.
But from Laura's telling, she didn't fully understand just how much the field was changing until she was invited to speak at a gender conference in 2015.
It was an annual conference, and I'd gone there every year, I'd been invited.
She was one of 4 panelists discussing age limits for hormone treatments in front of an audience of other clinicians.
Part of what I was asked to talk about was the assessment process and what it entailed and why it was important. And it turned into this very tense conversation about assessment being this hurdle that people were being made to jump through. And one of the other panelists, just felt very strongly that it was completely unnecessary, and she even said, re-traumatizing to people to have to tell their story a second time, or if they'd already told it, when they came out to their parents, and that alone was shocking. That that there was this opinion, perspective that the mental health role was causing trauma to the patients that we were trying to help. But then I think what was even more shocking was the reaction from the audience, which was a standing ovation for the person who was commenting about assessment so negatively. People just were suddenly seeming to feel like it needed to be child-led entirely, and that there could never be complicating factors that needed to be looked at. That it can never be because someone experienced a traumatic event, or they're just fed up with what's expected for them as an assigned female. And so they want to escape that. That the gender piece was always just in and of itself a separate thing that we needed to treat as quickly as possible. Whereas that's never been the way I've seen it.
We spoke with one of the other providers on the panel and the conference organizer. They both said the discussion was tense and that it really became a 2-person debate.
Laura talked about a conference in 2015. You were both on a panel.
Between Laura and the doctor who had gone after her approach.
She also said you got a standing ovation. Does that track with, do you have a similar memory of how this happened, this played out?
I remember that, not the specific event. I'm just, thinking about getting a standing ovation because I don't remember that at all. But
as it turned out, this doctor had also been watching what the Dutch were doing back when word of their protocol was spreading around the world. But she'd thought about it very differently.
Year-long assessment or 6-month assessment, I think that we started recognizing in some cases that's doing more harm than good, especially when you're talking about a puberty timeline.
And it was this way of thinking that was starting to take hold in the U.S.
What happens if you require someone to be in therapy for a year, but they have no interest in that? That doesn't make sense.
So Dr. Joe Olson Kennedy, do you pronounce your name Johanna or Joanna? Johanna, with the H.
Dr. Joe Olson Kennedy joined the faculty at Children's Hospital Los Angeles back in 2006 in the Division of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine.
So can you tell me about your own work here? When did you actually start providing this care?
So I do not think of myself as a single individual. I want to go back in history and talk about really this work arising from HIV care. And so we had an HIV youth program before we started doing gender care, and that included a population of older adolescents and young adult trans women, many trans young women of color. And so when these young people were coming in for HIV-related services, either prevention, testing, or treatment, they were beginning to ask, hey, can you do our hormone-related care here? And so it's not widely publicized, but we began within the division to do that care in the early 90s.
So when Jo came in, the clinic was already working with some older trans teens. But then, right around the time she started, the Dutch published their outline for using puberty blockers, the same one that inspired Gems to send Laura to the Netherlands.
Right after it was published, I don't remember the exact details surrounding that because it's been a long time, but it made sense, and it was right off the bat brilliant. I mean, it made complete sense. We knew that people going through their endogenous puberty left them with changes that they would never be able to walk back, and that was especially considering the population, right, that we're working with. We knew that historically it's identifiable trans women of color that are the targets and the victims of violence and sometimes homicide. And so if we could create a situation whereby they were not identifiable, that's life-saving. It was like a piece that clicked into place. And in fact, I remember saying, this is so obvious. It's kind of astonishing that somebody didn't talk about this or think of this earlier.
It sounds like it intuitively made so much sense to you that you didn't have to wait till 2011 or whenever they published their first batch of data on these kids.
That's right. That's right.
When you started incorporating puberty blockers into your treatment here in LA, were you following that protocol that they had introduced over there?
So the idea, I think what they did was what they needed to do. Like any area of medicine, when you're first starting something or introducing a new mechanism for caring for people, probably err on the conservative side, not knowing like what's going to be on the other end of that.
While Jo immediately understood the transformational power of this new intervention, she wasn't as convinced as Laura about the rigorous assessment process the Dutch were doing. In part because when she started prescribing puberty blockers around 2007, the kids who were coming in looking for help weren't really young kids, like many of the kids the Dutch were seeing. Some had already started their natal puberty, or were just about to.
If you truly want to use puberty blockers to block puberty, you can't do a year of assessment when they come in right around the time of puberty. You have to do that in concert with that intervention.
The way Jo saw it, these patients were up against a clock. Delaying the treatment defeated the purpose of the intervention. But she also had some deeper issues with the assessments the Dutch did.
One of the things that the Dutch repeatedly did was intelligence testing. And so they published
IQ tests, yeah.
Right? And so do we need to do intelligence testing? There was never really a compelling reason to do that, given that they had done this over and over again and found that the intelligence was the same as the population at large. So what other things were they doing around therapy, especially if they were excluding people with mental health issues? So I'm not sure. I don't know that there's ever been information published about what were you doing in those therapy sessions, besides honestly making yourself feel comfortable about the gender that the young person is asserting.
Can you talk about that a little more? Like, do you think is that what you? Do you think assessment is sort of, it's clearly trying to get a sense of greater certainty about how a kid will identify in the future. You're laughing, so I want to hear what your thoughts are about that.
I hope that if they figured that out, they would publish that. Because I have never for any certainty had or read a publication about here are the things that tell us if somebody's going to continue to assert this gender over time. Who are you assessing now that in 30 years did not assert the same identity? Who is that, and how did your assessment help you with that? I think that's a really important question.
To Joe, it was unrealistic to think that mental health providers could somehow predict the outcome for these kids decades down the line. And she said even trying to predict it was going to affect their relationship with their patients.
If somebody is in the role of an assessor and they're supposed to also be creating a therapeutic alliance with somebody, those things are at odds with each other. And there actually has been,
it sets them up as a gatekeeper.
Well, I mean, being the person that checks a box that says you can move forward with medical interventions, I think, there have been some data, and I don't know I can't quote the exact article right now, but that has demonstrated that if people know they're sitting with someone that's going to either check off the box or not, if you're worried that you're going to disclose something about your life that then is going to keep you from getting what you deserve and need, you're unlikely to disclose that information. And that's a problem. You don't want that.
And so, as Joe began to meet with patients, she said she felt comfortable as a medical doctor doing her own assessing of the care they might need.
I mean, every patient in medicine gets assessed.
And often, she said, the kid was also talking to a therapist while they were going through this process. But Joe didn't think it had to be mandatory or for a set period of time.
There are huge benefits to mental health therapy, but I don't think you just can say, each person needs exactly this amount of therapy. That's not how humans are. I think that if there was evidence that demonstrated a year of assessment changed the outcome for young people, then I would have been like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But there really hasn't been that.
But it was also the only data that we had at that point, right? The Dutch by 2011, that was the only data we had.
We'd been doing the care since 1991. So yes, there's published data, but there's also experience in the field. And experience in the field is what we have when data is being collected. Our experience matters. Experience in healthcare matters.
The way Joe was thinking about assessment reflected a broader push that was underway against so-called gatekeeping in trans medicine for adults. For years, patients and advocates had been challenging the prominent role of psychotherapy and were finally getting doctors to ease some of the requirements for treatment, including the need for patients to get a letter of approval from a therapist before starting hormones. They argued that these requirements showed an ongoing mistrust of trans people and of patients' own understanding of who they were and what they needed. Joe was among a growing group of providers who were making a similar case for kids, that the strict requirements of the Dutch protocol were outdated and perpetuated that mistrust, and that children should be believed when they say what their gender is. Not long after she started seeing patients,
Dr. Joe Olson says children are born this way.
Joe began to talk publicly about her approach.
It's a different process for each child. Young people and their families come in very different stages of this process. It's really important just to support your kid.
Now, what does support look like?
It's different for each kid. I mean, there are kids.
And she also began speaking about something else.
We often will ask parents, would you rather have a dead son than an alive daughter?
She started to talk about this care in life or death terms.
To me, it seems ridiculous to have a kid at age 12, 13, 14 deciding whether they want to have biological children when they're 20, 30, or 40. I mean...
Well, they make the decision to kill themselves at 12 and 13. That's a pretty powerful decision.
Joe wasn't alone in this either. As visibility around trans kids was growing in the U.S., there was also growing awareness that, like trans adults, this was a group at much higher risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors than the general population. One frequently cited study from the time found that nearly half of the young trans people surveyed had seriously considered dying by suicide. About a quarter of them said they had actually tried to.
There are high rates of depression, anxiety, suicide attempts.
So providers like Joe and parents and kids who had received the care
would you rather have a happy kid or would you rather have a dead kid?
Talked about the urgency of getting kids what they said they needed.
You know, there are some transgender children that have not been able to be transgender, who even want to die.
Yes, and that's why I'm doing this with you today. I want to help those kids become the person they are, and I want to tell the parents that they should still love them no matter what.
Whenever people ask me, how can I just let her do this? I'd rather have a living transgender daughter than a dead son.
In speaking out so publicly about this, Joe became one of the most prominent and influential voices in the field, advocating for what came to be known as the gender-affirming model of care for kids. It didn't require kids to meet strict criteria for medication. It rejected watchful waiting and set periods of time for therapy or assessment, and the ages kids could start medications shifted too. They no longer had to wait until they turned 12 to start on puberty blockers or 16 for hormones. It was a model that prioritized treating kids on their own timelines because the stakes were high. In 2012, as Joe's profile was rising and as demand for care was growing around the country, Children's Hospital Los Angeles officially opened a youth clinic dedicated to gender services, and they made Joe the medical director. A few years later, she got a multi-million-dollar federal grant to lead the first big study of youth gender medicine in the U.S. Just a few weeks after that, she appeared at that conference with Laura.
That was one of the most difficult experiences I've ever had in the field.
And Laura realized just how dominant Joe's approach was becoming, and just how out of favor her approach now was.
When I started to see the field shift, the nightmare that I had was if things continue to move in this direction that I'm sensing they're moving, where assessment's no longer going to be really valued, young people are going to move more quickly through this process to medicalization. More of them are coming in. The cases are more complex. At the same time the cases are more complex, we're cutting corners. What's going to happen? Well, probably there's going to be more people who realize it was the wrong decision. And then what's going to happen? Well, probably it's going to result in backlash. For after all of these years of work that we have tried to move the society forward with accepting trans people, people are going to start to question it and question, is this even something we should be doing at all? Especially with youth. And so I started talking about that. I would tell my students, I probably sounded like a broken record, but I just had this gut feeling that if things did not slow down quickly, we were going to have a nightmare on our hands. It was because of this that I agreed to be interviewed by Jesse for the Atlantic piece, because I couldn't sleep at night.
In 2018, The Atlantic published what would turn out to be a highly controversial article about youth gender medicine in the U.S. and the debate over how best to approach the care. The writer Jesse Singal spoke with several people who did feel they had made the wrong decision and had either stopped treatment or reversed the medical transition. It was one of the first high-profile stories to focus on a group of people who were coming to be known as detransitioners. In some cases, they talked about feeling rushed into a decision they weren't ready for and getting medical interventions that weren't right for them. Laura was interviewed for the article, and she said she believed there would only be more of these stories in the coming years because there were so many kids who weren't getting a comprehensive mental health assessment. Joe was also interviewed, and she said that the small number of kids who later regretted their transition shouldn't influence how care was provided to everyone. She said the approach that tries to prevent regret in advance is a, quote, broken model.
Then the Washington Post piece was the other huge event, I guess, in terms of me speaking out.
A few years after the Atlantic article, Laura spoke out again, this time more directly and alongside a high-profile co-author, another clinical psychologist named Erica Anderson. She was the head of the American branch of WPATH, the group that set the standards of care in the field. In 2021, they published an essay in the Washington Post called "The Mental Health Establishment is Failing Trans Kids." And in it, they said that providers were increasingly engaging in, quote, sloppy, dangerous care. They called out doctors by name, including Joe, who they noted prescribed hormones to children as young as 12. They said that in advocating for a model that followed the child's lead and that believed if a child said they were trans, they were, some doctors had, quote, confessed to ignoring the standards of care. They said, quote, none of this means that we shouldn't be listening to the views of gender-diverse teens. It only means that we should listen in the fullest and most probing way possible. And they ended by calling out advocacy organizations and medical providers for what they said was silencing people who expressed regret about transitioning and sabotaging open dialogue in the field. In the aftermath of the Post essay, the American branch of WPATH issued a temporary moratorium on its members speaking to the press, and Erica resigned from her position as the head of the group. Laura said she had received emails from many healthcare providers privately telling her that they agreed with her.
Like I told my husband and my friends, this is it. Like, okay, it's going to be somebody else's turn to step up to the plate. And, but it just hasn't happened.
But they were afraid to speak publicly about their concerns.
And I guess my perspective is that if I were a parent going through this and no one was talking about it, I would be livid. I would be absolutely livid. And I
mean that doctors and psychologists are having these conversations behind closed doors where they can't access them.
Right. Yeah. When if my child was like going through this and and then to find out that the providers were being told not to speak about it also, I would feel like, what the hell is going on here? Like, that is very suspicious. Like, I would be, questioning everything. So I just feel like in order to be transparent with the public and with families going through this, we have to be talking about it. And we have to be coming up with a solution to move forward in a better direction. Like, we need to be problem solving.
Laura thinks while some of the reluctance to speak up was because of the pressure from groups like WPATH, she also thinks some of it was self-censorship, because something else was happening around this time.
In terms of your Washington Post piece was November 2021. I mean, that year was the first year, that was when Arkansas passed their ban, which was the first ban, and then...
This was when political opposition was intensifying in red states around the country. In the months before Laura published her essay, there was growing momentum for restricting or banning this care for kids. And state lawmakers were citing sloppy care and kids regretting their transitions as part of their justification. So fear was growing in the medical community about the consequences of voicing any questions or concerns.
The op-ed that Erica and I wrote, we spent I think 6 months on that. Largely, I would say, because we kind of vacillated back and forth about whether we should do it for that very reason. Like, we were worried that it would be used in ways that we didn't want it to be used. And we kind of knew it would be to some extent. And so we knew that that was going to be something we were going to have to deal with. Mm-hmm. Good will hopefully come out of it, but there could be some bad that comes out of it too. And it is very unfortunate that it's been used in ways that we did not want it to be used to support the bans. I'm not in favor of the bans. I really strongly feel like this should be a decision that is made by the family, parents too, when we're talking about minors, and the healthcare providers who are involved. This should not be something that is dictated by, the government. That's crazy.
in 2022, more bills targeting gender-affirming care for young people were introduced in state houses across the country. And then, in 2023, there was a legislative onslaught. Over 100 bills were introduced. And right as legislative sessions were getting underway,
of a whistleblower investigation, this woman claims children are being harmed.
Another person from the medical world did speak out.
Jamie Reed worked at the pediatric transgender...
Somebody who had similar concerns to Laura about the way care was being provided.
Reed said the center pushed children into puberty blockers and hormone therapies without proper mental health assessment.
But who did not share her belief that the government should stay out of it.
We're on the
cusp of this legislative thing.
And you're diving straight into it. I mean, you're already in it.
What is the other option?
That's next time in part 4.